Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And I have to say, you did a fairly good job of pronouncing my last name over there, which I know can be somewhat intimidating if you don't say it too much. But hopefully, like with many other people, we'll be on a first name basis, and so you won't need that anyway. But it is such a pleasure to be with everybody, and of course to be part of the phenomenal program. I have to say at the boot camp, I've been following the program with some envy, and I only wish I could have participated more than I've been able to. I am grateful in turn. I will share that I'm joining you today from my home, which is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Squamish First Nation in what is known as North Vancouver in British Columbia. And as you can see, this is a really breathtaking place. It's situated between mountains and water, which is why the Squamish First Nation is among the Coast Salish peoples for whom a traditional saying is, when the tide goes out, the table is set. And as an immigrant settler, of course, I reflect deeply on the history of this land on which I live, work, and play, and on which my wife and I have been blessed to raise our children. I honor the wisdom, the teachings, the languages, and the traditions of the ancestors who've been on this land since time immemorial. In addition to acknowledging the land, I really also want to acknowledge that we are, as even Robin talked about earlier in the week, no doubt, living through what's effectively a global poly crisis on the heels of a major global pandemic. That multiple global systems are causally entangled in ways that are significantly degrading humanity's prospects. That political violence and economic uncertainty, for example, are taking resources and taking attention away from widening societal inequities and climate action. And whether or not we are attuned to this, of course, this affects us as individuals. As a psychologist, I'm going to say it affects us physically, cognitively, and emotionally. But as someone who has the privilege of supporting educators every day, this is worrisome to me, in part because as educators, I think our daily work constitutes an act of hope in pursuit of a better world. And as Bell Hooks wrote, hope is essential to any political struggle for radical change when the overall social climate promotes disillusionment and despair. And admittedly, it does feel like there is rather a lot of disillusionment and despair going around, right? I don't think it's an accident that the keynotes this week have focused on oligarchs, neoliberalism, plutocracy, and fascism, on the environmental impacts of hungry silver farms and the resurrection of shuttered coal and nuclear power plants, and on student protests calling for the decolonization of the curriculum. I also want to acknowledge that this is also an especially challenging time for the post-secondary sector here in Canada, with weekly news stories about layoffs and program closures at universities and colleges across the country. And while a lot of this, of course, has to do with the blunt and I would say damaging changes that were haphazardly introduced a year ago to federal policies concerning international student caps, at a deeper level, I think it really is the result of systematic underfunding of the sector, which in turn reflects a weakening of the societal recognition of the value of higher education. For example, if you look at the last decade, total spending by provincial governments across the country has actually risen by 30% over and above inflation, but it's spending on post-secondary education that has actually flatlined and then dipped. Interestingly, if the provinces had increased their investment in post-secondary education as much as they'd increased their investments in pretty much everything else, this would have amounted to about $9.5 billion, which, according to an analysis by Alex Usher, is actually almost identical to the increase in income post-secondary institutions have seen in revenue from international students over the same period. So, yes, international students came to our shores at our invitation, benefiting from the education, the experience, and the pathway to immigration, while our nation, our society, and our sector were enriched by their financing, their labor, and of course, their brilliance. And those same international students today are being scapegoated, are being alienated, and being demonized, blamed for everything from taking jobs and straining the asylum system to driving up housing costs and increasing pressure on healthcare. And as a former international student myself, I'm of course deeply pained by this false and misleading narrative. But this week and this boot camp hasn't just focused on the problems facing this world or our sector, right? It has also posed critical questions around how we can acknowledge expertise according to different epistemologies and cultures, how we can include students in decolonizing our curricula, how we can reconcile and even reorient our work in open education to address sustainability efforts. And it has served both skill development and community building. It's really an excellent program. And so it's aiming for the goals of criticality on the one hand, but practicality on the other. And coming, quite frankly, from a deep confidence in and personal experience with the transformative power of higher education, that I've elected to focus my time today on problematizing the relatively simple narrative that continues to surround open educational practices, both the adoption of open educational resources and the embrace of open pedagogy, and doing so in order to push our pedagogy towards what is more effective resistance, and in order to strengthen that very essential hope that I talked about. So let's start by talking about open educational resources. Now, as many of you will already know, especially if you attended the OER basic session earlier in the week, OER are, of course, learning, teaching, or research materials in any format, in any medium, that either reside in the public domain or are under copyright that have been released under an open, typically Creative Commons license. And that permits the no-cost access, reuse, repurpose, adaptation, and redistribution by others. We know, of course, that one of the major driving forces when it comes to increasing adoption of OER over the last decade, certainly, has been challenges with course material affordability, in particular, of course, increases in the cost of commercial textbooks. And as you can see from this very famous graph at this point, increases in textbook costs greatly outpaced inflation for a very long time before finally hitting a plateau over the last few years. These are data from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. Thanks to Jonathan Poritz for massaging those. We also know, of course, that the unaffordability of course materials has affected our students in a variety of ways that has compromised their educational outcomes. So I'll share some recent data for you from a study that we conducted at Brock University just over the last few months, where we found, for example, that, I'm just going to pull this up overall, and we'll try and talk about them going from top to bottom. We found that 72% of undergraduate students did not purchase required course materials for at least one of their courses, that 58% report jointly purchasing course materials with a classmate in at least one case, that 44% make difficult sacrifices in order to afford required course materials, 32% earn a poor grade, 30% take specific courses, 22% do not register for a specific course, 20% take fewer courses, all as a result of high course material costs. So this is not going anywhere. This has been a trend that's been getting worse over time. So overall, if you look at the bottom, we can see that 61% of our students are reporting being influenced by the cost of course materials in some way. And that includes 27% of respondents who said that they were influenced by cost in all of their courses in some way. This is research that was conducted in collaboration with PhD students Oya Pakal and Wenting Rong, as well as with my colleague Laurie Morrison from the Brock University Library. And sadly, in our research, just as others have seen before, we found that first-generation students were more likely to struggle with course material affordability, including by being more likely to take fewer courses, drop or withdraw from a course, and make personal sacrifices in order to afford course materials. And by difficult sacrifices, I mean, if you look at the open-ended comments in our survey, things like I went without fresh food. I chose between updating my prescription for my glasses and buying course materials. I missed my rent, and even I had to steal food to feed myself. And so once again, higher education is structured so that normative practice, such as adopting a commercial textbook, ends up reinforcing existing societal power hierarchies. Now, of course, this is where as many of us will know, open educational resources can come to the rescue, as we know from research across the world, including, of course, in Canada, that students assigned free and open textbooks tend to perform the same as or even better than those assigned expensive commercial textbooks. And that while the use of OER, sorry, I'm catching up with myself over here, improves end of course grades and decreases D, F, and W rates for all students, they actually tend to improve course grades at greater rates for students from marginalized backgrounds, as was the case in this large study from the state of Georgia shows, for Pell recipient students, for part-time students, for populations historically underserved by higher education. And this is why many universities, including my former institution, Kwantlen Polytechnic University, invested in developing institutional supports for open education, including not just supporting faculty in the discoverability and adoption of OER for individual courses, but also aiming for the vertical integration of OER adoption across a program pathway in the form of zero textbook cost or ZTC programs and credentials. Now, no doubt, these programs have had a large and positive impact on students. And as you can see from these charts, for example, between spring 2019 and spring 2025, students at KPU saved nearly $16 million in textbook costs. And what is more, these cost savings did not come at the expense of educational outcomes, as students enrolled in zero textbook cost sections tended to have lower rates of D or F grades, as well as lower withdrawal rates, while at the same time enjoying higher GPAs than those enrolled in non-ZTC sections. If you're interested in learning more about the impact of this specific program, which is, of course, what Canada's first zero textbook cost program was, you will see this study appear in the next issue of the journal Open Praxis. But again, moving beyond the simpler narratives, this is where we need to go deeper. As this important paper by Sarah Lambert reminded us, when it comes to advancing social justice and open education, we need to consider not only redistributive justice, which is the allocation of material or human resources towards those who by circumstance have less, as with the adoption of OER, but also recognitive justice, which has to do with recognition and respect for cultural and gender difference. This is where, for example, we consider the sociocultural diversity of the curriculum. And further, we need to think about representational justice, which has to do with equitable representation and political voice, such as when we are inviting co-construction of OER about learners of color by learners of color. So whereas zero textbook cost programs that are centered on the adoption of OER certainly advance redistributive justice, we might think about harnessing the affordances of open licensing to advance recognitive justice, as demonstrated in this wonderful article by Alison Kelly and their colleagues, wherein underrepresentation of historically marginalized psychologists was redressed in OER for a history of psychology course. Or even this wonderful article by Amy Nussbaum, which chronicled a crowdsourcing approach to diversifying OpenStax's psychology open textbook in ways that actually had an ameliorative effect on the sense of belongingness among first-generation students. Now, I learned a lot about representational justice from a cherished colleague at KPU, the late Arlie McNeely. For those of you who didn't have the privilege of knowing Arlie, she was an exceptional instructor of applied communications, a disability rights activist, a Paralympian, an author, and a compassionate, trauma-informed open educator. She was also the author of Business Writing for Everyone, an open textbook that she developed in collaboration with communicators from diverse backgrounds in order to meet the needs of a diverse student population. And among the acknowledgments in this book, you will see the names of 30 students, almost all racialized, who reviewed early drafts and provided thoughtful feedback. Now, the principle of representational justice, I think, is perhaps exemplified by this thoughtful observation by Erin Okuno, that equity isn't for all. Equity is for those farthest from justice. And if we are working towards true equity, those farthest from justice can define for themselves what they need to be whole, healthy, and in just relations with others. And this is where I also draw on the work of people like Cheryl Hodgkinson Williams and Henry Trotter, and for example, their social justice framework for understanding open educational resources and practices in the Global South. Drawing on the work of Nancy Fraser, they position social justice as parity of participation, as both an outcome in which all the relevant social actors participate as peers in social life, but also as a process in which procedural standards are followed in fair and open processes of deliberation. They explain that both outcomes and processes can be socially unjust in three ways: through economic maldistribution, which many of us are focused on, but also cultural misrecognition and political misframing. They also distinguish, if you look at the columns, between responses to injustices that are merely affirmative, positive, but not necessarily transformative, and those that actually change the game. For example, on the economic dimension, you can reduce the cost of education by adopting open textbooks in place of commercial textbooks. That's a positive, if ameliorative response. But transformative responses would do more to address the root causes of economic inequality. So providing stable power supply, adequate access to functional computing devices, affordable and stable connectivity in rural environments. On the cultural dimension, one could use OER from the wrong context as is and actually do harm. Translating OER into a local language by using the permissions of open licensing is a step forward as an ameliorative response. But a truly transformative response might include, for example, remixing OER critically to engage with, but also to challenge hegemonic perspectives. And on the political dimension, we might look at intellectual property rights. An ameliorative response would be to ensure that educators have the copyright for their own teaching materials. And so they could then openly license them if they choose and share them publicly. But a transformative response would be to alter current IP legislation to allow for educational resources properly attributed to be copied and shared without formal permissions or obligatory fees. So with this in mind, I think let's consider the case of traditional knowledge, right? Because indigenous intellectual property, of course, is not adequately protected, certainly under the Canadian Copyright Act, and indigenous knowledge such as, songs, oral stories, traditions, they fall outside of colonial notions of ownership. And according to the Canadian Federation of Library Association, who holds legal copyright to that knowledge or cultural expression under Canada's current Copyright Act is often contrary to Indigenous notions of copyright ownership. Indigenous knowledge may be found in published works as a result of research or even appropriation. And in these cases, the author of the published work may hold that legal copyright to that knowledge or cultural expression, while Indigenous peoples might see the owners as the people from where the knowledge originated. And so, as in Western notions of copyright, Indigenous peoples regard unauthorized use of their cultural expressions as theft. So respecting the ownership of indigenous intellectual property is, I think, one of the reasons why the development of traditional knowledge labels has been so valuable. These were developed through sustained partnership with indigenous communities across multiple countries, and the labels allow for communities to express local and specific conditions for sharing and engaging in future research and relationships, but in ways that are consistent with already existing community rules, governance, and protocols for using, sharing, and circulating knowledge and data as well. The traditional knowledge labels identify and clarify community-specific rules and responsibilities, and that could be about access and future use of traditional knowledge. This could include sacred or ceremonial material, material that has gender restrictions, seasonal conditions of use, or materials that are specifically designed for outreach purposes. And to learn more about the traditional knowledge labels, I encourage you to visit localcontexts.org. But the broader point that I'm trying to make over here is that as educators who work to support the creation, adaptation, and adoption of OER, we need to engage in this work critically to ensure, for example, that we do not neglect accessibility when we are thinking about equitable access, that we do not just slap an open license on materials, but we're actually actively working to facilitate technical openness, including by not requiring the use of proprietary tools for reusers downstream to revise or remix our OER, that we are considering low bandwidth and even offline OER, that we are not mindlessly embedding tracking and analytics into our OER platforms and instead respect data privacy, and that we are also doing everything we can to avoid relying on undercompensated labor or even uncompensated labor when it comes to OER creation. Because if you think about it, doing that only perpetuates and exacerbates recognitive and representational injustice. And so it is in recognition of the vital importance of considering social justice in the context of OER that a previously common and popular research framework for studying the effects of OER has been updated. So as a field, we used to really rely a lot on the COOP framework, which considered cost as in cost savings, outcomes as in educational outcomes, use as well as perceptions of OER. And now increasingly, folks are thinking about scope, which stands for social justice, first and foremost, and then, of course, cost savings, educational outcomes, perceptions, and engagement as well. But now let's move beyond OER and perhaps even consider broader approaches to open educational practices, including what is known as open pedagogy. And given that there isn't really one universal, rigid definition of open pedagogy, which I think is not a bad thing, I'm going to share 3 definitions with you today. And we'll start with Catherine Cronin, of course, an important scholar in the field, who has described open pedagogy as the use, reuse, or creation of OER, but also collaborative pedagogical practices employing social and participatory technologies for interaction, peer learning, knowledge creation and sharing, and ultimately empowerment of learners. It's a lot of wonderful themes over there. Next up, we have the approach that Robin DeRosa and I took in thinking about open pedagogy as an access-oriented commitment to learner-driven education, but also as a process of designing architectures or using tools for learning that enable students to shape the public knowledge commons of which they are a part. And finally, I want to share a definition from a delightful recent publication that I read called Pedagogy Opened, Innovative Theory and Practice. And here, Teherina describes open pedagogy as teaching and learning practices and environments that promote equity, collaboration, and innovation, and that invite students to create and share knowledge with future publics, often in association with the use of OER. And if you think about it, cutting across all three of these definitions, you will identify values such as access and equity, as community and connection, opportunity and risk, and of course, agency and ownership. And this is because open pedagogy draws not just on open licensing and OER, but also the tradition of critical pedagogy, which is why it is perhaps easier to understand it in contrast to the more traditional banking model of education described by Paulo Freire in his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. He wrote that it, as in the banking model, turns students into containers to be filled by the teacher. So the more completely she fills the receptacles, the better a teacher she is. And the more meekly the receptacles permit themselves to be filled, the better the students they are. And so education thus becomes the act of depositing, in which students are the depositories and the teacher is the depositor. And so in the banking concept of education, knowledge is a gift bestowed by those who consider themselves knowledgeable upon those whom they consider to know nothing. Now, open pedagogues, by contrast, aim to design learning environments that take seriously questions of both access and agency, as we've noted, while infusing our work with open content and often using open tools. Now, this is in part about decentering the role of the educator. It's about democratizing the learning environment. And so while OER may be a feature of this work, it certainly doesn't have to. This is really about co-creating the learning journey with students. Consider, for example, learning outcomes, right? These are important and helpful, especially as we seek to align outcomes with activities and assessments. But these also ought not to be so rigid that the learning journey is entirely prescribed even before we've met our students. With open pedagogy, we might, for example, grant our students agency to help determine some of the course topics. We might co-create course policies with the students, or schedules of work, or even assessments. And in fact, redesigning assessments is among one of the most popular forms of open pedagogy. As some of you will know, this is in part because traditional assignments are in many ways disposable assignments. And it sounds a bit pejorative, I know, but if you think about it, these are assignments in which students work for hours, for only one person, typically the instructor, to view their work. And they certainly serve a purpose in terms of skill development and learning, but it is possible to redesign assignments so that they don't end up just in the physical or digital recycling bin. We can design what are known as non-disposable or renewable assignments. And as this conceptual framework for non-disposable assignments outlines, these assessments typically enjoy a larger audience than the instructor, a longer life than the semester, and a greater impact than individual student learning. Now, the classic example of a renewable assignment is, of course, a Wikipedia assignment, wherein students work to create, update, or refine Wikipedia articles as part of their coursework. But it can extend to a wide range of practices, from students creating instructional videos and question banks to students updating or even authoring open textbooks. If you're interested in browsing through examples of open pedagogy in practice, I will point you to the Open Education Network's Open Pedagogy portal, which contains case studies, student work products, and resources to support your further experiments with open pedagogy. But we can go further still, because as Henry Giroux points out, critical pedagogy asserts that students can engage their own learning from a position of agency. It takes seriously the educational imperative to encourage students to act on the knowledge, values, and social relations they acquire by being responsive to the deepest and most important problems of our times. And it's because there's perhaps no better illustration of the deepest and most important problems of our times than the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals that you might draw inspiration from the now international, interinstitutional, and interdisciplinary Open Pedagogy Fellowship that was first conceived at Montgomery College in Maryland, and that has now spread all over the world. Shout out to my colleagues Shinta Hernandez and Mike Mills. But the example on the screen is among my favorite creative renewable assignments. It was designed by instructors from two institutions, Kwantlen Polytechnic University and Montgomery College, and across three disciplines. As you can see, urban ecosystems, sustainable horticulture, and anthropology. And it involves students using the iNaturalist app on their phones to map out the edible weeds on their various campuses in an effort to address food insecurity at a local level. And now, just as was the case when working with OER, engaging students in open pedagogy also demands that we take a critical approach to avoid perpetrating harm with the very best of intentions. This is why in this article, Mahabali, Catherine Cronin, and I sought to extend the Hodgkinson, Williams, and Trotter social justice framework for OER to broader open educational practices. And as you can see, we tried to articulate contexts in which, despite the best of intentions, open practices may be neutral or even negative if it's done, for example, without student agency or the choice to opt out of public scholarship, like Wikipedia assignments, if it reproduces hegemonic knowledge, and if students are not appropriately informed or equipped for how to engage in open practice and its risks, such as when marginalized students are disproportionately targeted or harassed online. Open practices can certainly be ameliorative, right? If they can address economic injustice, for example, by producing resources or scholarship that then become accessible to populations who would not otherwise have been able to afford access. But practices like this can either be instructor-centered or learner-centered. They can either be content-centric or process-centric, and they can either be primarily pedagogical or primarily social justice focused. And these are the lines along which we will typically see the difference between OEP that are ameliorative and those that are truly transformative. And in the latter case, it's marginalized groups that are involved in the design of the content and processes, and both epistemologies and structural academic gatekeeping may be challenged. I want to take this moment to share a brief clip of one of my favorite educators, Dr. Jennifer Hardwick, who is an English instructor at KPU, talking about her critical approach to teaching writing. See if we can get this clip to work.
Because I've been using open pedagogy in my classes for the last 5 or 6 years, and I've used renewable assignments before and media assignments before, and I think they're very effective. I think they allow a kind of creativity and engagement that a lot of other assignments don't. And I am a writing instructor primarily. I'm interested in good communication, and I think that that communication should extend in the digital age to different kinds of assignments, different ways of employing rhetoric and self-expression. And so this is a good opportunity to encourage students to think about those skills. I'm also interested in using open pedagogy because I want students to think deeply about it, and I want them to think about access to information and the ethics that guide that. Both the ethics of what we see now in education in terms of the high costs of textbooks and the inaccessibility of a lot of resources, but also on the other end, the way that the academy has been complicit in extracting knowledge and in monetizing knowledge that doesn't necessarily belong to the people who are doing the extracting. And so I want students thinking carefully about the information that they gather and the information that they share, and how to do that in ethical ways. And I think that open assignments are a great way to introduce those conversations.
Oops, there we go. Jennifer is just a marvel, of course, and I think it's approaches like hers to open pedagogy that can lead students to derive a lot more pride, a lot more enjoyment, and positive beliefs about writing, as also found in this recent article in Open Praxis about undergraduate students who were writing papers about marginalized pioneering psychologists and choosing to contribute their work as chapters to an open educational resource. But of course, another example comes once again from the work of Arlie McNeely, whose authorship of Business Writing for Everyone I mentioned earlier, and who routinely empowered her applied communication students to choose their own research question, to pick something that really mattered deeply to them. And in this case, two of her, see if I can pull this up, two of her classes chose as their research question the impact of textbook costs on students. And so the students engaged in collaborative research, they engaged in surveys of and interviews with other students, and they wrote this report. But they didn't stop there, because the next phase of the project involved them recreating the report for different audiences, right? Creative assignment, very meaningful. And that's when a group of three, especially creative students, developed a board game about textbook affordability based entirely on the report and the real lived experiences of their peers. And the game included everything from decisions about what books they could afford to purchase or rent or have to do without, to dealing with random life events, whether it's positive or negative, that could influence their financial circumstances and their academic performance. And so Arlie and the students then presented their work, presented their research, and facilitated, in fact, a tabletop play of this physical board game at the Cascadia Open Education Summit held in Vancouver in 2019. And I will tell you, without a doubt, that student-led session was a highlight of that conference. And it was shortly after that conference that Arlie and I worked with the tech wizard and, of course, Saskatchewan resident, Alan Levine, to adapt the game into an interactive web format that you're seeing on the screen using H5P's branching scenarios. And we embedded it within the Pressbooks publishing platform. And this game, of course, is now openly licensed. It's available for you to play. It's not easy, it shouldn't be, and even to use as a faculty development tool. You know, one of the things to think about this that I've noticed over the years is, as with the development of the scope framework, for example, for research on OER, um, this kind of these kinds of critical approaches to open educational practices have become a little more common, a lot more common, perhaps, as the field has grown more diverse. And this may be because, as Sarah Ahmed, for example, writes in her book, The Feminist Killjoy Handbook, you tend to notice worlds when they are not built for you. Right. And this is why it was such a joy for several of us to work on the volume Open at the Margins, Critical Perspectives in Open Education, which was an attempt at critical pluriversalism. This is a curated collection of 38 blog posts, lectures, talks, articles, but really informal works by diverse authors, 43 of them. And each of these contributions focus on issues such as decolonizing the use of student data, openness and surveillance, increasingly important, digital redlining, and inequitable power dynamics when it comes to global knowledge production. And they offer perspectives on open education that might be considered marginal, but that challenge the dominant hegemony. But what they also point us to is the importance of design justice, of considering how design distributes the benefits and burdens between various groups of people. And of course, design justice focuses explicitly on the ways that design reproduces or that it challenges the matrix of domination, which includes everything from white supremacy and heteropatriarchy and capitalism to ableism, settler colonialism, and other forms of structural inequality. But what I'm saying is that when we work within systems and norms that uphold exclusion at every turn, it is relatively easy to engage in openness on the surface and in content while working against it in structure and in process. It's like saying that everyone is welcome to use the sidewalk, but not bothering to design or install curb cuts or curb ramps. Or saying that everyone is welcome to use public benches, but deliberately adopting a hostile design that prevents, for example, the homeless from sleeping on them. We need to draw on principles of design justice, including designing to sustain, to heal, to empower our communities, as well as to seek liberation from exploitative and oppressive systems, to center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process, and to prioritize design's impact on community over the intentions of the designer. Alongside this, we ought also to consider principles of trauma-informed practices, including physical, emotional, and academic safety, trustworthiness and transparency, and awareness of social inequalities. But the question is, what does this look like in practice? Well, in at least one example, so this is a recent experimental study that I conducted with, two PhD students at Brock, Oya Pakal and Anita Twele, as well as Lindsay Gavush, who some of you will know from the New England Board of Higher Education and her leadership in Library World. What we did is we systematically manipulated the descriptions of course policies, course materials, and course assessments in course syllabi to consider the impact on students' intent to register in the course, their sense of belonging, and their perceptions of the instructor. And as you can see, in the control condition, we aim to reflect relatively normative practices, such as an expensive commercial textbook with an access code for a homework system, a traditional research essay, and inflexible assignment deadlines. But for the remaining conditions, we began to operationalize elements of redistributive justice, for example, such as with the use of OER to alleviate the cost burden, recognitive justice, such as with increasing sociocultural diversity in the curriculum, but also emphasizing a trauma-informed classroom environment, and representational justice, such as with including a Wikipedia assignment that specifically focused on redressing underrepresented epistemologies. And while this article is currently under review, I can tell you that the results showed that using these justice frames, this was perceptible to students. It led to an increased intent to register for the course. It led to increased feelings of support and acceptance as measured by a couple of subscales of the university belongingness questionnaire, and more positive ratings of the instructor. And it wasn't just the case of students from or with marginalized identities, but across the board. So it was a main effect. And so the point here is it is possible to design for justice in ways that take seriously our core mission as educators to widen equitable access, to empower learners, to cultivate critical consciousness, and to lead societal transformation. Having said that, I don't think it's up to individual educators either, alone. Institutions need to play a role here in reshaping the structures, the systems, and strategies in higher education so that we do not continue to see a disconnect between the nice words in our strategic or academic plans and the harsher reality, which too often, I think, reinforces and replicates existing societal power hierarchies. Whether we're talking about institutional supports for non-traditional learners, you think about first-generation students who do not have access to the hidden curriculum, or you think about sessional instructors and supports for them, right? Sessional instructors, adjunct instructors, they might love to engage in professional development if this was built into their contracts, if this did not require them to volunteer their time. So institutions need to ensure that we align our incentives and our supports. So even with something as obviously beneficial as open educational practices, where, as you know, students benefit from significant cost savings, instructors benefit from greater pedagogical flexibility, and institutions benefit from gains in student enrollment and persistence and performance, it's essential to provide support so that people are not swimming against the current to embrace open practices. This is why I appreciate that both UBC and Brock's tenure and promotion criteria recognize the creation of OER, whether as a form of educational leadership as it is at UBC or innovative methods of teaching as it is at Brock. This is why when I was at KPU, we worked to weave support for open practices into our policies, our procedures, and our practices, including everything from encouraging members of the university community to create or adapt OER in the intellectual property policy, to integrating a library-supported search for relevant OER during the process of curriculum development or curriculum review, and adding a searchable filter in the course registration timetable that enables students to identify courses and sections that had zero required textbook costs. This is also why our Senate at Brock right now is considering an ethical framework for educational technologies that, as per our academic plan, will ensure that the procurement of digital tools do not perpetuate and reinforce systemic inequalities and racial biases. Right? This is important because in this space, we too often look at privacy and accessibility legislation and treat it as the ceiling when it comes to ethical discussions, when in fact legislation ought to be the floor. This is also why I think we must look to our moral obligation to effectively respond to the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to the principles of the Tri-Council's Dimensions Initiative, and to our commitments. And of course, Regina as well as Brock are both signatories of the Scarborough Charter on Anti-Black Racism and Black Inclusion in Canadian Higher Education. What I mean by this, and what I mean by showing you all of this together, is I think we know exactly what designing for justice would look like in higher education. It's the outcomes of these three documents. It's the promises contained in these three documents. And so while there are forces that are acting upon us, we do retain the agency to choose, to construct, for example, classrooms of control on the one hand, or to cultivate communities of possibility. We can choose, even as individual educators, to weaponize concepts such as rigor, or we can understand that excellence without equity is not true excellence. Instead, it's simply privilege reproducing privilege. We can adopt a more critical, a more inclusive, a more open approach, one that leads with trust of students and trust of faculty, one that supports humans and one that fosters humanity, especially as the world burns. And so in closing, what I would love to do is just leave you with the very powerful words of one of my favorite authors, Arundhati Roy, which I think I hold closer at times such as these. Because another world is not only possible, folks, she is on her way. And on a quiet day, I can certainly hear her breathing. Really appreciate the opportunity to participate in this wonderful boot camp and event and follow the wonderful speakers this week, folks. But I look forward to our conversation and discussion. But yeah, and I welcome, I mean, it doesn't have to be, welcome questions, but certainly just comments and reflections, because I think, this is a lot looking around us, and especially to find and build community. It's important that that we hold ourselves accountable and think critically about the path that we're walking towards over here. But while we're waiting as well, I'd love to ask, in fact, just your own reflections over the week. I mean, it's been an extraordinary set of talks, of workshops, very practical sessions. Some, of course, aimed at basic introductory sessions. Some fairly high-level critical discussions as well. So I'm curious from your perspective as well, Shona, what themes you're noticing and the kinds of questions you've been seeing that have been not quite addressed yet, but that people are asking as questions.
Well, not so much questions. I think that despite the heavy and difficult times, the seeds of hope that Robin mentioned seem to be what are coming through. Like we're dealing with a lot of change and a lot of craziness and chaos in our world right now, and yet there are seeds of hope. And I think the bountiful research that you've brought forward today, and I'm hoping you'll share your slides with us so that we can further explore what you've been bringing to us. It's that whole development of the open movement and how it's moving into critical pedagogies and opening up a space for everyone to be included in their own learning materials. I think that's so important, and that is coming across as it does policies. Yes, they're top down, but it's these acts by the individuals who are involved in open education that are making a change, that are tipping the balance, tipping the scales. So
yeah, I appreciate it. And yeah, I mean, to be fair, I mean, I know particularly as a university administrator, I have a love-hate relationship with some of the data points I share, right? Because whereas I can tell you, for example, that embracing OER can affect institutional tuition retention, it can affect persistence, and some of these other pieces. I mean, the reality is that it often makes me feel like it reminds me of when somebody gives me a business case, like if you've ever done a workshop with somebody in HR and they give you the business case for inclusion because it makes teams more creative in terms of their thinking and better ideas and more productivity. And I don't need a business case for inclusion. I certainly don't need gains in student enrollment to tell me that embracing open practices is the right way to go. But of course, you recognize the importance of unlocking certain doors, unlocking resources and supports and reshaping systems. And so by extension, I would say, I think Robin for me has been such a great inspiration over the years. And one of the things I love that she reminds us constantly of is, open is important, but open is not the thing. Open is something en route to a vision of I'm thinking about bell hooks again over here, who talked about education is ultimately about the act of caring for the souls of our students. And so for education is about that vision of a different kind of world, a different kind of education, one that allows us to care for the souls of our students. And so that's the ultimate goal. It's open is not the thing. Open is the means.
It looks like we have a comment from Taruna.
Yeah,
in your
absolutely.
slides. You mentioned designing to heal and sustain. As important as these are, how do we move from the current lenses of designing for usability and accessibility to that of liberation and sustainability? Great question. If there's one mind shift you'd suggest for educators and institutions to move in this direction, what might that be?
It's a really, it's a big question, and thank you for posing it, Tarana. And I wonder how this is understood and interpreted and experienced in different contexts. I mean, I know, for example, there's such a desire to try and, especially with accessibility, right, take a sort of checkbox approach to things. And even if we're talking about frameworks for things like universal design for learning, right, and there's a lot more awareness about it these days, of course. And there's tensions over there as well. If you think about, you know, so I'm thinking about a couple of things in my mind over here, so I'll try and back up and vocalize them. But UDL on the one hand, of course, is not the answer to all things. It's not necessarily going to address all of the issues at hand. It is a tool. It is a framework. It is a way to move in the right direction. But I recognize, for example, that imposing a checklist, an inflexible approach, perhaps, and insisting and even if it's in your strategic plans, thou shalt embrace UDL everywhere. What does this mean in terms of overburdened, exhausted instructors? If the structures that they are nested within lead instructors to experience a tension between their own sustainability, their own ability to function and thrive in ways that allow them to extend care to students, and the requirements of a checklist approach to accessibility, again, it's a perfect illustration for me of how we're completely doing harm with the best of intentions. So I think those more thoughtful approaches, but there's no simple answer to I think the question you're posing. But I do think a lot of it has to do with posing these critical questions, not pretending that there are simple solutions to complex issues, and ensuring that there really is an alignment. It's one thing to say that we're striving for something in our strategies, and sometimes we don't, right? So that's a step. Sometimes we don't have the support of when it comes to resources or administration to move in this direction. But sometimes we say that, but we don't provide the support. Sometimes we provide the support, but in reality, it's structured in a way that really doesn't set up that embrace. So I think, if you're looking for a mind shift question, I would say one of my observations is that this happens for a variety of reasons, but too often we leave it for those who are from a particular or have a particular marginalized identity to advocate for themselves. And sometimes it's because we don't want to speak for others. It certainly is important to remember the refrain from the disability justice movement, disability rights movement, in terms of nothing about us without us. But at the same time, I would pair that with, it's important to not leave the burden, whether it's the emotional labor or the risk of advocacy, not leave advocacy just to people from marginalized identities, right? So it's important to be effective allies. And so this is where, it's not going to just be left to the people who actively participate in communities of practice around liberatory pedagogies, who come from backgrounds that allow them to understand and notice worlds, ways in which the world is not designed for them. So I think that sense of this is our shared world. This is not just a fight for Indigenous colleagues if it comes to responding to the calls to action of the TRC. It's not just important to our Black colleagues in terms of Scarborough Charter commitments. This is important to all of us. So I think that shared recognition and involvement and desire to roll up our sleeves to expend our political capital on behalf of this world, especially in ways where we are not directly benefiting. I think that's the mind shift I would point to more than anything else. And then, of course, not taking that overly simplistic checklist kind of approach to things like accessibility as a good example, right? This work is relational. and it can't be broken down to simple metrics. It can't be broken down to check boxes. This is really, the battle for the soul of higher education is one that is waged, within the heart of the educator, but at the same time within the broader structures that the educator is nested within. And I think it's one thing to change hearts and to win hearts and change minds, but to do so when you're nested within systems that are continuing to perpetrate trauma and reinforce privilege, that's a Pyrrhic victory.
Linda Cox agrees and says we need accessibility, UDL, liberation, and sustainability, everything. And welcome back, Linda. Galera, I don't know if I'm Jella. I think this maybe goes back to the issue of control that we're holding on to. I think we have known how adaptive, inclusive, and flexible learning works for many years. And Ryan, I'll read them all, you can respond. Ryan says, yes, as an instructional designer, I've certainly seen how some more rigid approaches to accessibility can encourage an oppositional attitude between instructors and students, rather than the one that encourages seeing accessibility work as an element of collective sustainable liberation.
Oh my God, yes. I I couldn't agree more. Oh, excuse me. I'm thinking about reflections in recent years. You think about pandemic pedagogies and the move towards surveillance capitalism in the classroom, right? Um, you know, I recognize again, there's that tension. When instructors were feeling a loss of control, there was a desire to reclaim it. But, you know, changing pedagogies to fit remote emergency teaching versus insisting on adopting remote exam proctoring would be an example. And today we're seeing, of course, with Gen AI, and I feel like we should issue a digital badge or send a bouquet of flowers to anybody who manages to get through a talk these days without mentioning Gen AI. But you know, the kind of mass moral panic and the drive once again, as though we didn't learn the lessons of the failed approach with remote exam proctoring. Now we're seeing a lot of folks running after tools that purport to detect the use of Gen AI in student coursework, for example. And again, it's just these are the wrong questions, right? And so thinking about the nature of learning, what we want to achieve. Yes, of course, things like workloads and support and class size all play a factor over here. But taking a step back and thinking about what we're really trying to achieve, um, it's still too often, assessment of learning instead of assessment for learning. And so, I think these broader questions need to be posed, and you know interpreting our current challenges in ways that perpetrate this kind of strange dynamic where it's almost it encourages people to adopt carceral pedagogies effectively instead of liberatory pedagogies, because it's perceived that there is this dynamic where what is good for the student makes it difficult for the instructor. What is good for the instructor requires you to be cruel to the student, right? So we can head in the direction of absurdities, right? And we're not far off, but if I don't think the world we want to see is one in which students, submit to retinal scans and DNA swabs before being chained to a desk and administering an oral examination. This is not caring for the souls of our students. And so I think that, the Gen AI tidal wave is only the latest one, but the question remains the same. What is the vision of education? What is our approach? What are we really trying to achieve over here? And if there's something we need to jettison along the way, maybe there's an opportunity to take this moment to loosen our grip on some of those bits of the system that are clinging on to us through inertia. But I appreciate Judith's comment. And Judith, it's great to see you in the chat. My goodness. Judith is of course, just a hero of mine and many others. I appreciate your comment around resistance to change by authority. Those in control is escalating injustices. Absolutely. It's complex in some context, as with blind students' disabilities in general. And I think this is where, again, it's helpful to think about redrawing these systems, because too often I see that decisions are made at tables not out of malice, but out of ignorance and lack of representation of diverse lived experiences at those decision-making tables. And so again, there are times where it's going to be important to make sure that the right voices are at the table. But there are times, even as administrator, where I will say, this is not a table that's worth even inviting people to. Let's flip it over and build a new table, for example. So, um, but I think you cannot ignore the power dynamics over here. And so what I would hope to see more of is people like Judith in positions of senior leadership at institutions making some of these decisions.
I think too, when your focus is on soul care, like you said, and transformative learning, AI becomes a non-issue. And then also because the focus is correct, the students are given the power that they deserve as people. So
Absolutely. I mean, it's simple things. As educators, we want to be treated with respect, with care, with dignity. This isn't some secret recipe. The fact that learning flourishes under those very same conditions should not be a surprise. So I think again, that is the vision of the world in front of us, right? And that's what our efforts need to be directed towards. And it's a lot easier when we have these conversations out loud, when you hear that it's not just you who's thinking and pushing in this way. And so again, I really want to thank you, Shona, and the team at the University of Regina for organizing. This is not, of course, the first year you've done this, but what I really look forward to now, you're doing a lot to build community and give people these hope and providing the fertile ground to sow some of those seeds of hope. So thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you everybody for participating and sharing these thoughtful observations and questions.